Hello, my name is McKenna Bonn-Savage, and my presentation is about Ākala, which is an endemic species in Hawaii in the Rosaceae family. The scientific name is Rubus hawaiiensis, and it is colloquially called the Hawaiian raspberry. Growing up, my grandparents have always grown raspberries, and to this day, they are my favorite fruit, by far. When I learned that there was an endemic species of raspberry, I knew that this was the plant that I wanted to present. It also has very interesting etymology, which I will get into in the next slide, and some other characteristics that make it unique to mainland raspberries. So let's get into the etymology of this plant. So what does the word Ākala mean? In Olelo, Hawaii, Ākala is the word for the color pink, which is the color of the dye created from the fruit of this plant. I will get into what this dye was used for a little later, but let's go back to the word. So Ākala means pink in Hawaiian, but as you know, a lot of Hawaiian words have a lot of different meanings. So as well as the word for pink, Ākala also means it's referring to the literal dye that comes from this specific plant, as well as the name for the plant. You can see the Ākala, the Hawaiian raspberry, in the background of this slide, and I'm going to talk a little bit about its habitat. So Ākala is found in mesic, which means moderate, to wet forests from 600 to over 3,070 meters, as well as in subalpine woodlands. So this basically means, in less scientific terms, that you will find this plant at higher elevations and not on the beaches. It's in forests, it doesn't deal with coastal winds, it doesn't deal with high salt concentrations. It just likes a lot of water and likes to have a relatively undisturbed habitat. So our hawaiiensis has a much rarer cousin called Rubus macraei, found in rocky areas in wet forests and bogs, only on the Big Island of Hawaii and East Maui. I just thought that I would bring this up because while Rubus hawaiiensis is found a little bit more commonly, its cousin is under a lot more stress, being so much more specialized to rocky areas and wet forests and bogs. Going back to Rubus hawaiiensis, as well as in higher elevations, you can find it in Kauai, Molokai, Maui, and Hawaii. You will not see it on Oahu, and you will not see it in Niihau or Ko'olave, Lanai, the other islands like that. The Hawaiian raspberry can be described as a creeping shrub with shredding bark. What this means is that it's a shrub. It grows to medium size, about 6 to 10 feet, and it creeps. So it doesn't grow very tall. Instead, it has adapted to creep across the forest floor. Because it prefers mesic to wet forests, we can infer that this is maybe in the second layer that you would see in a Hawaiian rainforest below the canopy. So not necessarily a large tree, but not necessarily ground cover either. This plant is considered long-lived at greater than 5 years, and its flowers are considered showy, with pink and white blooming flowers appearing in April through July, which is not much different than mainland raspberries. The leaves are medium-sized with a coarse texture. The upper portion of the leaves is prickly, and it is a dark to medium green. As you can kind of see in the background that I chose for this slide, with the Hawaiian raspberry and the EEV, which is one of its pollinators, and also a native and endemic species to Hawaii. The fruits of this plant are quite interesting, and as you may have seen in previous slides that I have shown, the fruit is quite large. It is one of the largest raspberry fruits on Earth. If you were to hold it in your hand, it would take up a good portion of your palm. Like, it wouldn't be as big as your palm, but definitely a majority of it. So it is interesting that this raspberry has evolved to be so large. As we have learned in our previous worksheets and videos that we've watched, a lot of plants in Hawaii have actually evolved out of these sort of features, where we have briarless briars and nettleless nettles. And this plant seems to have gone in the opposite direction. So instead of getting rid of its raspberries or making them smaller, making them a different color, they have grown larger. And this may be because they don't face as many predators. Nothing is grazing them, and its pollinator is EEV, and it doesn't need a lot to attract the EEV. So due to this lack of predators and its isolation, the raspberries have evolved to be quite large. So the native Hawaiian use of this plant is one of the most interesting parts about this plant, in my opinion. The native Hawaiians were able to find uses to make their clothing, dyes, food, medicine, and even spiritual rituals. They found a way to use almost every part of the plant, and it was clearly an important part of their culture. So for the clothing, they would use the fibers from the bark of the Hawaiian raspberry to make kapa, which is a cloth made from fibers of various trees and shrubs, including raspberries, even though it wasn't the preferred material. But kapa was used as clothing as well as artwork. Men would use it as a loincloth, and women would use it as a wraparound, typically. As I mentioned before, the dye from the fruit of the Hawaiian raspberry appeared a pink to rose-colored dye. And this was used to dye the kapa. So as well as using the Hawaiian raspberry to make the kapa sometimes, they would actually use it to color the kapa and to color their artwork and their other various clothing. One of the most obvious uses of this plant is that the berries and flowers were eaten. They are not as sweet as the mainland raspberries. They're actually a bit more bitter, but they were definitely eaten and used by the native Hawaiians as a treat, as a part of their diet. And they are actually eaten today, which I will get into in the next slide. So as well as these, they were also used medicinally. So ashes from the burnt plant material, which was usually the stem, were used to treat dandruff, heartburn, or mixed with poi to induce vomiting for various stomach ailments. So if clothing and eating was not enough, it actually had quite a few medicinal uses, and one of which is actually still used today by modern society. So the last use of this plant that I want to talk about is the spiritual significance. So during various rituals, the Ākala was invoked by kahuna as a symbol of freedom. So in modern day, this plant is obviously not utilized as much as it was in ancient Hawaii. One of the uses that remains is that people eat it. As I mentioned before, the fruits are quite a bit more bitter. So rather than just eating them as raspberries, you can find that these fruits are used for making preserves, and you can find them in pies or malasadas, which is why I decided to put a picture of malasadas in the background here. And the other use that is still significant today is medicinal. If you actually eat a lot of these raspberries, it can act as a sort of laxative. So while the ashes were used by native Hawaiians to invoke vomiting mixed with poi for stomach ailments, it actually can still help with stomach ailments as a laxative, which is quite interesting. Another very important point to consider when talking about native or endemic plants in Hawaii is their endangered species status. So nativeplants.hawaii.edu, which is one of the sources that we've been given for this project, says that there is no status. It doesn't have that information, so it didn't assume anything. That's good. That means it's a reliable source. Now, another source that I found, called explorer.naturereserve.org, says that they are imperiled on all islands of Hawaii. We know from other sources that they don't actually appear on all islands of Hawaii, but it can be taken to heart that it says they are imperiled. Now, as I mentioned before, the cousin to the Rubus hawaiiensis, Rubus macree, is much, much rarer, only appearing in very specific places on very specific islands. We really need to proceed with caution. Just because a website says that our hawaiiensis is not in peril now doesn't mean that it won't be. I thought it was important to include a climate map for the background of this slide because the climate really affects the growth of all endemic species in Hawaii, including Ākala. That is not to say that that is the only source of danger for endemic plants. Clearly, human development plays a very large role, and invasive species as well. But as you can see on this climate map in the background, the islands are getting warmer and the colder regions are getting smaller and moving up higher. This, for the moderate to wetland forests, is not a good thing, and I can predict that we will see some danger for our Hawaiiensis and our mackerel and all of their endemic species in those forests. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation about Rubus hawaiiensis, or Ākala, or the Hawaiian raspberry. I hope you learned something, and you all have my email on Laulima, so if you have any questions, please reach out to me. Thank you.